Good day. Today is Wednesday, 9th April 2025, and today I think one can say confidently that we are in a full-fledged economic war between the United States and China. As of today, the additional 50% tariffs that the United States imposed on the import into the United States of Chinese goods came into effect, with the result that Chinese goods exported to the United States are now subject to a 104% tariff. That's a staggering, eye-wateringly high tariff. I cannot imagine that trade in goods between China and the United States, the export of Chinese goods to the United States, can withstand these pressures, and there will inevitably be a significant decline. I will come to that shortly, the effect of that shortly. China, for its part, perhaps somewhat to President Trump's surprise, refuses to back down. There was some uncertainty yesterday about how China would react. There were some suggestions that China might back down in the face of the Trump tariffs and would seek some kind of compromise. President Trump himself seemed to think that. I discussed yesterday in my previous program the really strange, or rather the overstated Truth Social post that President Trump published discussing his supposedly productive telephone conversation with the new acting president of South Korea. I've come to the conclusion that the real purpose of that Truth Social post was not to highlight a pending economic deal agreement with South Korea. Rather, it was to signal to China Donald Trump's willingness to seek a compromise. In fact, if you go to the very end of that Truth Social post, you'll find that Trump also comments that China is also keen to do a deal with the United States. The only problem is that they don't know how to go about doing it. Now, I've seen absolutely no evidence that this is in fact the case from the Chinese side. It may be what Trump was expecting. It may be what some of the people who have been advising him, or some of the people who have been influencing him, have led him to believe. But on the contrary, the Chinese, so far from looking to do a deal, so far from calling the United States, he actually said in the Truth Social post that the United States was expecting the call. So far from the Chinese making the call, what they've done instead today is they've slapped a further 34% tariffs on American exports to China, bringing American exports to China up to 84%, which is again an eye-watering figure. Here I think it is necessary to make an important point, which is that beyond a certain point, adding percentages to already incredibly steep tariffs simply becomes an exercise in adding noughts on to a particular number. We now have 100% tariffs on Chinese goods entering the United States. We have 84% tariffs on American goods entering China. Slapping on more tariffs over and above this is not going to make any significant difference, because realistically, the price of the goods supplied as a result of the tariffs is already going to be so high that it is very difficult to believe that many goods will actually trade at these kind of prices anyway. So going back to Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions, secondary sanctions against Russia, the idea that raising sanctions on China still further, if China goes ahead and continues to buy Russian oil, raising them from 104% to presumably 604% or something of that kind. We've reached that stage now when it really isn't going to make any difference, because it's not going to have any significant effect on China's trade, because the United States is already so heavily tariffed that I can't really see what sense doing that would make any longer. Anyway, if I am right in thinking that Donald Trump was not expecting the Chinese to respond in the way that they have, and I'm confident that I am, actually, but on the assumption that I am right, that Donald Trump did not expect things to go so far, and was expecting that after he slapped the 34% tariffs on Chinese goods onto and above the 20% tariffs he'd originally slapped onto Chinese goods. If I'm right in thinking that Trump assumed that the Chinese would come round and would negotiate, then he has forgotten, or perhaps he never knew, what I call the first law of diplomacy. The first law of war, and this I owe to Field Marshal Montgomery, is never march on Moscow. The first law of diplomacy, I've made this point many, many times, is never bluff Beijing, because the bluff will always be called. I've said this many times, and that exactly is the scenario that we're now perhaps starting to see. Now, this may explain some of the angry comments about China that are starting to come out again from the United States. So I've read comments made by American officials that now is the moment to liberate Asia from the effect of China's malign influence, malign economic influence. Basically a call to all Asian countries to stop trading with China, which is an astonishing demand, and one which I cannot imagine these Asian countries will ever heed. It would devastate their economies were they to do that. There's other statements of a similar kind being made as well. One statement I heard was again a repetition of the old Biden-Blinken line that China was acting in a malign way because it was only through their support that the Russians were able to continue with their special military operation in Ukraine. An astonishing reversion to earlier rhetoric, and one which completely cuts across the rather muddled steps the United States has been making under Donald Trump to try to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end. Anyway, the rhetoric, as we see from the United States, is becoming increasingly shrill as it becomes increasingly clear that China is in no mood to back down. And, well, why should it? The rhetoric, as I said, in the United States is becoming very shrill, but as is often the case with China, they themselves have responded to the latest events, as one might have expected, by publishing a rather cool, if I can call it that, a rather cool white paper which the Chinese government published yesterday. And this white paper basically gives China's account of the state of trade between the United States and China, And obviously, it sets everything up very much from the Chinese point of view. But nonetheless, it does contain some factually interesting material, and it gives some reasons to understand Chinese confidence ahead of this trade war. First of all, it talks about how trade between China and the United States has grown exponentially since diplomatic relations between China and the United States were established in 1979. At the time when diplomatic relations were established, trade between China and the United States stood at something like $2.5 billion. That was the gross value of trade between China and the United States at that time. Last year, it stood at $688.28 billion. Now, that is, as this white paper says, a 275 times increase over the volume of trade in 1979. But, as the white paper also points out, China's trade with the United States has steadily fallen as the Chinese economy developed. The United States has become a less important trade partner than it used to be, and the United States, for its part, its trade with China has gradually shifted in character, changed in character as well. So in 2024, China's exports to the United States and imports from the United States accounted for 14.7% of exports and 6.3% of imports, total imports in 2024. Now, compare that with the situation earlier when the United States played a much bigger role in China's total trade. And the Chinese make the point that, yes, the United States continues to be the biggest market for many Chinese goods, particularly manufactured goods, but China has also become an increasingly important destination market for American exports. And it says this: US exports to China have grown much faster than its exports to the rest of the world. Since China's entry into the World Trade Organization, US exports to China have grown rapidly, making China an important export market for the United States. According to United Nations statistics, in 2024, US goods exports to China reached $143.55 billion, representing a 648.4% increase from the $19.18 billion in 2001. And China is an important export market for US agricultural products, integrated circuits, coal, liquefied petroleum gas, pharmaceuticals, and automobiles. China is the largest export market for US soybeans and cotton, the second largest export market for integrated circuits and coal, and the third largest export market for medical devices, liquefied petroleum gas, and automobiles. UN data shows that in 2024, China was the destination for 51.7% of US soybean exports, 29% of its cotton exports, 17.2% of its integrated circuit exports, 10.7% of its coal exports, 10% of its LNG exports, 9.4% of its medical equipment exports, and 8.3% of its passenger vehicle exports. And then it provides quite interesting picture of the overall character of the trade. So Chinese customs data, this is again from the Chinese white paper, shows that in 2024, China's top 5 export categories to the United States were electrical machinery and equipment and parts thereof, mechanical appliances and parts thereof, furniture, toys, and plastics, accounting for 57.2% of its total exports to the United States. China's top 5 imports from the United States were mineral fuels, that's to say coal, petrol, and gas, mechanical appliances and parts, electrical machinery and parts. Electrical machinery presumably means computers and iPhones and that kind of thing, optical instruments and apparatus, oil seeds, including soybeans, accounting for 52.8% of its total imports from the United States. Machinery and electrical products are particularly important in China-US bilateral trade, exhibiting an evident characteristic of intra-industry trade. Now, this is actually quite an interesting picture because what it shows is that China exports machinery and electrical products and other finished products to the United States. People in the United States, goods, the sort of goods that people in the United States buy, apparently mostly as consumer goods. I understand that the biggest single volume of exports from China into the United States are consumer goods, computers, iPhones, toys, whatever, furniture, whatever, plastics, things which, by the way, if they're not provided by China, might take some time for the United States to replace, and which will immediately translate into higher costs in the United States for American consumers. Whereas the biggest single import from the United States into China are energy products, oil, LNG, and coal, which of course China can find other suppliers for, Russia obviously being the most important. The Russians are very well placed to provide all of China's needs in terms of oil, LNG, and especially coal, but also agricultural products like soybeans, cotton, and such like things, for which China could also find alternative suppliers. Soybeans, China increasingly sources from Brazil, which, note, is a BRICS partner state. Apparently Russia is starting to develop a soybean agricultural industry as well. Cotton is, of course, abundantly grown in Central Asia, and probably enough cotton is grown there again to satisfy Chinese and, by the way, Russian needs in full. But other countries, Egypt also is a major cotton producer, for example. Anyway, there are various things. These are things which the Chinese could probably replace more easily through deft market actions than some of the things that the United States, many of the things that the United States imports from China. And to the extent that China imports machinery and electronic equipment from the United States, well, China is, of course, by far the world's biggest producer of machinery and electronic products. And again, it can probably meet its own needs fairly rapidly through expanding its own production. So, looking at this picture, the Chinese may say to themselves, well, we can cope with all of these problems. We can find ways, we can replace American goods on our market more quickly than the Americans can replace the goods we supply to the United States. And beyond that, we don't have the same sort of inflationary pressures in our economy that the Americans already do. In fact, our problem has been that we've been struggling with deflation. So an expansion of demand leading to higher production of our goods is probably something we can afford. We have very high savings, so we have the capital base to do it. We have suppliers who can enable us to do it as well. Whereas in the United States, interestingly, the government is already trying, the Trump administration is already trying to put pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates and even to restart QE. So I'm not saying that all of these Chinese assumptions will play out as the Chinese appear to think. There's always huge uncertainties in these matters. But overall, I nonetheless do believe that the Chinese have valid reasons for thinking that they can absorb many of the problems that this trade war in goods, can create for them. Now, for the moment, the tariffs are restricted to goods. But as the white paper also goes on to say, the United States has been running a surplus with China in services. And here again, I'm going to suggest that the reality is that the Chinese can probably fill the niche left by American providers of services to China quite quickly, more quickly again than people imagine. As I have pointed out many times in connection with sanctions on Russia, the idea that the Chinese themselves can't provide themselves with the full spectrum of banking services, insurance, accountancy services, legal services, that the knowledge and expertise to do all of these things in China does not exist and is exclusive to the Anglophone countries, the United States and Britain, is a fantasy. And I suspect that if this trade war intensifies, the Chinese will begin to strike back at the American services sector as well. Apparently, there are already calls in Chinese social media to do that very thing. And I suspect, again, I don't have the exact figures, but I suspect that were that to happen, it would be a heavy blow for American suppliers of these types of services, given the sheer scale of the Chinese-American trade system. I can very well imagine that law firms, accountancy firms, insurers in the United States have developed their sectors very much around this trade in goods and materials that have been taking place between China and the United States. Now, the Chinese also make a further point, which is that in terms of global demand, the United States' share of global demand has been reducing. 20 years ago, the United States accounted for 20% of global demand. Now that has fallen to 13%. There are various reasons, which I'm not going to discuss in this program, why I think that is an overestimate. I believe that America's share in global demand is now below, in fact, significantly below 10%. I think people, again, underestimate the scale of the markets that exist today in countries like China, Russia, India as well. Anyway, suffice to say, China since 2017 has significantly diversified its trade. It is no longer as heavily dependent on trade with the United States as it used to be. Now, if we go back to that figure of 688 billion, which is the trade between China and the United States, compare that with the trade between Russia and China, which now tops $250 billion and is quite likely to reach $300 billion fairly soon. And by the way, it is likely to continue to grow for many reasons, which again I'm not going to discuss in enormous detail in this program. Russia is rapidly becoming a very important trade partner for China. It's not at the level of the United States or the European Union, and I'm guessing it's still not at the same level as Japan, but it is growing fast. And the ASEAN countries also, and all sorts of other countries around the world as well. Now, going back to that comment that's come out of the United States about how the United States must do something to liberate the countries of Asia from the malign and predatory dominance of China's economy and all of that. Perhaps, quite possibly, there will be a drive over the next few months to try to get Asian countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, others, to scale down their trade with China. Already, also, apparently, India is coming under similar pressure. I doubt that in the medium to long term, or even the short term, this is going to succeed. It makes absolutely no sense for these countries to sacrifice their trade with the economic colossus next door to the demands, the geopolitical and demands of the United States. So I don't think that they will do this. A country like Vietnam, profoundly shocked by the 46% tariffs that have been imposed on it, rejected by the United States when it suggested zero tariffs by Vietnam, zero tariffs for the United States, a free trade policy, in other words. What realistic long-term alternative does Vietnam have other than to work towards establishing itself as an economic partner of China? It makes ultimately no real sense at all so far as I can see. Now, I say all of this, there's been an astonishing comment by a US official, Mr. Duran, who has been talking about the kind of things that countries need to do in order to get themselves back in favor with the United States. And, this applies presumably to all of these Asian countries as well. And it's all set out there on the White House website, and I will read it. First, other countries can accept tariffs on their exports to the United States without retaliation, providing revenue to the United States to finance public goods provision. Critically, retaliation will exacerbate rather than improve the distribution of burdens and make it even more difficult for us to finance global public goods. That was one. Second, they can stop unfair and harmful trading practices by opening their markets and buying more from America. Three, they can boost defense spending and procurement from the United States, buying more US-made goods and taking strain off our service members and creating jobs here. Fourth, they can invest in and install factories in America. They won't face tariffs if they make their stuff in this country. Fifth, they could simply write checks to the Treasury that help us finance global public goods. The last is astonishing. They could simply give America money. I mean, putting it in that way, this is from Mr. Stephen Duran, who is apparently some sort of economic advisor to the president. He's the chairman of the Hudson Institute. Anyway, I have to say, not only do the demands themselves, especially the last one, but the peremptory way in which they are framed, it basically asks, or so it seems to me, countries like Vietnam and even India to accept their role as economic colonies. Now, what makes it particularly difficult, I suspect, for these countries and for the governments of those countries is that all of this is apparently demanded of these countries as some form of burden sharing on the presumption that all of these countries have some kind of obligation to sustain American hegemony. Now, I put it in these rather crude terms, but this is what it says. The United States provides a security umbrella which has created the greatest era of peace mankind has ever known. The United States provides the dollar and treasury securities, reserve assets which make possible the global trading and financial system which has supported the greatest era of prosperity mankind has ever known. These are costly to us to provide. On the defense side, our men and women in uniform take heroic risks to make our nation and the world safer, preserving our liberties generation after generation. We tax hard-working Americans mightily to finance global security. On the financial side, the reserve function of the dollar has caused persistent currency distortions and contributed, along with other countries, unfair barriers to trade, to unsustainable trade deficits. These trade deficits have decimated our manufacturing sector and many working class families and their communities to facilitate non-Americans trading with each other. Let me clarify that by reserve currency I mean the international functions of the dollar, private savings and trade included. Now that makes it look as if this vast military presence of the United States all around the world is a simple benefit generously provided by the United States to all countries. It also makes it seem as if providing the dollar as the world's reserve currency, something the United States has insisted on. It has repeatedly acted to crush all alternatives to the dollar being established as the world's global reserve currency. That this, far from being a benefit for the United States, far from providing the United States with what General de Gaulle's finance minister in the 60s, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, called the exorbitant privilege. Far from it being that, it's somehow been some kind of crushing burden that the United States is somehow obliged to carry. Well, most countries around the world, many of them at least, might be forgiven for thinking otherwise. they might say, well, actually, we're able to do quite well, thank you very much. We don't need these vast American armies and fleets and garrisons located around us to keep the peace. We're perfectly capable of doing that by ourselves. As a matter of fact, we don't think that the United States keeps the peace in the way that it does. And of course, it doesn't keep the peace for our benefit. It does it first and foremost for itself. And as for the reserve currency status of the dollar, it was the United States ultimately that forced it on us. It did so firstly through the Bretton Woods system, when at the time of the Bretton Woods system, the British economist J.M. Keynes actually suggested an alternative reserve currency mechanism. He thought that it would not be proper to use the dollar for that purpose. It was the Americans who insisted. And of course, it was the Americans who insisted in the 1970s, when they broke the link to the dollar, that it was they who insisted and arranged with the Saudis that all trade in oil should be paid in dollars, thereby again securing the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency. Many countries around the world, faced with demands of this kind, being told in effect that your job from now on is to prop up American hegemony, they will say, and I think they will think with each other, presented with demands like this, that, well, if the Americans are so unhappy about maintaining these gigantic armed forces, if the Americans don't want the currency, the dollar, to preserve its position as a reserve currency, if they see that as a burden on themselves, one which is decimating their manufacturing industries and pauperizing the populations, their own population, well, the solution to all of that is in America's own hands. It can start to pull its armies and its fleets and its bases back. It can start to scale its military down. It can start interfering less in the internal affairs of other countries. It can give up on its hegemony. And as for the dollar, well, there's all kinds of things it can do to stop the dollar be used in that way. It can get its own fiscal house in order, first and foremost. It can stop running massive budget deficits. It can rein in its own spending. It can start living within its means, in which case, most probably, the reserve currency position of the dollar would gradually, of its own nature, start to fade away. So anyway, coming back to all of this to me, most countries around the world are going to see this and they're going to say to themselves, many countries are going to say to themselves, well, if this is the policy and Mr. Moran's words are there on the White House website, well, no, thank you very much. This isn't burden sharing. It's us paying the United States, including through direct transfers. Go back to that fifth one. They could simply write checks to Treasury that help us finance global public goods. They could simply say, well, no, we're not prepared to accept this. We're not prepared to bankroll American hegemony in this kind of way. That really does make us vassal states of an empire which is becoming increasingly coercive. What we want to be is free and sovereign countries determining our own future. We don't want to be economic colonies in some greater empire run from Washington, which demands that we, in effect, pay its tribute in return for so-called public goods, the dollar, and the presence of the US military, which we find increasingly burdensome. So, as I said, confronted with this kind of rhetoric, is it realistic to think that countries like India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, other countries in East Asia are ultimately going to say to themselves, well, we should accept this, we should write checks to the Treasury, we should tax our people and dismantle our manufacturing so that the Americans can continue to rule over us in the way that they seem to feel that they're entitled to do. I have to say that the crudity of this particular statement on the White House website is incredible. And I think it was a serious error of whoever it was who authorized its publication on the White House website to do so. It seems so provocative that it is almost bound to provoke a reaction. Now, I said that Mr. Moran, the people behind this statement on the White House website, basically that they're demanding the preservation of US hegemony, and that they seem to imply that the reserve currency status of the dollar has not been a privilege but a burden, and they seem to think that it's the job of other countries to lift that burden off America's shoulders. And I said that one of the reasons why the dollar has been able to maintain its reserve currency status, and this of course has been talked about and written about by people since the early 1960s. There's a famous American economist called Tiffin who previously made that point, that in order to run a reserve currency you must have a current account deficit, and that means basically overspending on your budget, just to say. Well, the United States could go about having again a proper budget. It could run its budget properly. And now going back to that Chinese white paper, it says, and here perhaps, one can be a little cynical. In fact, one can be fully cynical if one chooses. China never deliberately pursues a trade surplus. I would say straight away that I don't believe that. I think that China most definitely did pursue a trade surplus at other earlier times in its history. But anyway, if we move beyond that, the next point that it makes, it seems to me, is a valid one. The trade balance in goods between China and the United States is both an inevitable result of the structural issues in the United States economy and a consequence of the comparative advantages and international division of labor between the two countries. China does not deliberately pursue a trade surplus. As a matter of fact, the ratio of China's current account surplus to GDP has increased from 9.9% in 2007 to 2.2% in 2024. This is absolutely true. By the way, foreign trade for China has become an increasingly less important aspect of China's GDP. But note the point about the structural issues in the US economy. And that brings us back to the original point. The reason the United States runs a current account deficit is because in the 1960s and early 1970s, it itself made the decision that it would do so. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, around the time of the crisis of the Vietnam War, which I discussed extensively in my program yesterday, when the United States first became aware that it was running a current account deficit. The United States basically had a choice. It could either scale down its commitment to preserving its global hegemonic position, its leadership of the West, which at that time you could argue had some purpose to it, because the United States at that time was still leading the West in the Cold War, in the struggle against the Soviet Union and the communist powers. Either it could do that, either it could retreat from that position, or it could make a decision to preserve the current account deficit so as to preserve its global reach and global status. And it chose the second, and it restructured the entire global financial and trading system around that by pursuing that set of policies, which eventually came to be called globalization, which basically was about maintaining currency and financial flows into the United States so that the United States could pay for all those military bases and other things, and preserve the reserve currency status of the dollar and all of those things that Mr. Duran is now complaining about. So that was the choice the United States made then. And of course it's free to change its views today, but it does seem really very, well, I would say that it sticks in the throat for the United States now to come round and complain that all of this is the work of cheating by other countries, that they're not sharing the burden with the United States as they should, that they're taking advantage of the United States, when it was the United States itself that willed it that things should be this way. Now, having said all of this, let me repeat again, I do believe and I do think that some kind of readjustment of the economic system in the United States is absolutely essential. And I wonder whether behind all this rhetoric, all this language, whether behind Mr. Duran's comments, there isn't at some level, perhaps some conscious level, within the more intelligent, amongst the more, well, maybe not intelligent, but far-sighted and thoughtful people within the Trump administration, some sense that, in fact, the time to end this hegemonic policy, to end the position of the dollar, to finish with the reserve currency status of the dollar, to start scaling down US military presence around the world, whether that isn't, in fact, the ultimate objective, whether blowing up the system is the only way they can see to do it, and whether that's why they've taken the steps that they have done. Now, it's an intriguing possibility, and I don't think it's one that should be entirely discounted. Some weeks ago, Glenn Deason and myself were privileged to have a discussion with the former British diplomat Alistair Crooke. You can find the video that we did on the Duran. But before the program took place, Alistair Crooke actually told us, Glenn Deason and myself, that he had some understanding that within the United States, amongst people connected to the administration, there might be some sense that the reserve currency status of the dollar from being a source of American strength, has for America become a curse, making it possible for the United States to choke on endless money emission, to import goods, to neglect its own manufacturing industries, to pauperize increasingly large sections of its population. And that the United States needs to find some mechanism, some route out of this, because persisting with it will ultimately undermine the internal harmony and vitality of the United States itself. And implicit in that was a sense that the United States would have to start thinking about withdrawing from its position as a global hegemon. Now, those words stayed with me after Alistair Crook said them. I have no idea whether this was just his own insight or whether he had some knowledge. Mr. Crook is a very knowledgeable man, and I know that a lot of people speak to him. Anyway, I don't know. But reading comments like this by Stephen Moran, reading other things that I've been hearing from others say, and some of the comments that I hear from people in the White House and connected to it, I think we must face the possibility that that agenda to do that, to retreat, is indeed there. Now, if so, however, one must also say that there are enormously strong countervailing forces, because after giving hints over the last couple of weeks that he wanted to see steep reductions in defense spending, what does President Trump do? He signs off on the biggest defense budget, I understand, in American history, a defense budget of over $1 trillion. So that doesn't look especially like the action of somebody who wants to retreat, to pull back from the world. It could be, as I said, that there are competing pressures within the United States. I simply don't know. One thing I am confident about, and I repeat this again, I don't think that the Trump White House, certainly Donald Trump himself, will willingly retreat from these tariff policies. Not only is Trump himself, I am sure, convinced of the rightness of what he is doing, but I notice that he has recently been he's been inviting to the White House people from the old industries of the United States, the neglected industries of the United States. He's had a whole group of coal miners, for example, and he's been photographed with them in the Oval Office. He's spoken to them about the importance of defending what they do, of rolling back all of the green policies of the Biden and Obama eras and focusing instead on building America's economy and rebuilding and safeguarding these old industries. And I believe that he does actually generally care for these people, and that they do relate to him and will continue to support him in what he is doing. And they appear to believe that protection is the way to secure their industries and their jobs. And I think Trump thinks the same. So anyway, there we are. We are in an extraordinary, complex world. I don't think the administration is going to back down. I don't think China is going to back down. I think this giant trade between China and the United States is going to end. I think certainly in the short to medium term, the bigger impact is going to be felt in the United States as opposed to China. I think the Chinese are prepared carefully for what is to come. I think the Chinese have many more cards to play. I would not be surprised to see tariffs and restrictions on supply by the United States of services to China. I would not be surprised if we saw over the next couple of weeks a further escalation in trade conflict between these two countries. I am not sure at all where the eventual equilibrium will be found, but we are at an earth-shaking moment in economics, and I don't myself believe that either the United States or China are in any mood to turn back. There will be more losers. There'll be losers in both countries, but there will be, I think, proportionately more losers in the United States. But I think that the president's core constituency will stick with him through this process. The fact that there are gyrations on Wall Street won't worry them in the slightest. There isn't something that they are at all concerned about. The fact that the president has fallen out with Elon Musk, who depends heavily on global trade for the success of his industries. Probably the other tech billionaires who supported the president are experiencing the same thing now. And of course, they've seen the share price of their companies fall as well as their fortunes. Anyway, again, I don't expect those people to find much sympathy in the coal mining towns and steel towns across the United States, which Trump probably sees as the core areas of his support. American farmers unable to export to China will probably be more severely affected, and they are historically Republicans. But I think that they are a diminishing part of the president's constituency. Just saying. And the fact that oil prices have fallen, taking the pressure off the pumps to some extent in the forecourts, in American gas stations, well, that will probably over time consolidate support for the president still further. As for China, as I said, they're prepared for this. They have a plan. They're not going to back down. They have Russia behind them. By the way, the Russian Foreign Ministry has actually spoken out strongly in support of China over the last few hours. I think that the Chinese also are in no mood to back down. I think that this divorce between the United States and China will now happen. The rest of the world will have to arrange itself around it. We're going to be drifting into economic blocks. And as I've discussed in recent programs, Britain has a prime minister who gives every impression of being the rabbit caught in the headlights of the oncoming locomotive. Doesn't show any sign or any idea of what to do. I understand that Jaguar Land Rover, is in crisis. And the European Union still overwhelmingly, obsessively, single-mindedly fixated on Russia and Ukraine. An issue which really one would have thought would be the least of their concerns now. Speaking of which, this is the point to return to that still very important topic. Let me repeat again my point from yesterday. What we are seeing happen in the United States now is also a response, an American response, a US response to defeat in war. The defeat the United States is suffering in Ukraine. And the United States is this has forced the United States to recognize the crisis in its own system. That crisis was already visible before. The Biden administration made the last big, desperate step to try to preserve the system as it was by defeating Russia and fulfilling the Brzezinski plan, and breaking it up, and according to the blueprint of Mr. Wes Mitchell, turning whatever rump Russia was left into an American vassal which would be aligned with the United States against China. That project has catastrophically failed, so the pendulum has swung in the United States towards the policies that we are now seeing. Now, over the last couple of days, I have been discussing at some length the military situation on the battlefronts. I don't propose to do so in anything like the same detail today. Suffice to say that everything continues as I discussed. In fact, my impression from reading the various reports of the various Telegram channels this morning is that the tempo of events is continuing to intensify. There are reports, for example, that in the Zherebets-Oskol River area, the Russians have now captured the village of Tolsky. These are reports, they're not confirmed, that they're preparing presumably to advance south towards Yampol, that they've made further advances towards Liman, that there is a major crisis brewing there. And there are also further reports that the Ukrainians have now begun some sort of withdrawal from Chasiv Yar, where their remaining troops are at risk, not just of encirclement. To a great extent, that is already the situation that they are already in, but of being trapped inside a cauldron and forced to surrender. Anyway, it looks as if there's a desire to escape all of that. Anyway, it does look as if some kind of withdrawal from Chasiv Yar is likely to take place within the next couple of days. And by the way, there are also reports that the Russians not only have secured fully Toretsk, but that Russian troops are advancing north of Toretsk. In fact, they've taken positions well to the north of Toretsk as well. And just to say, and perhaps the most dramatic information of all, if it is true, this isn't fully confirmed, is that in Volchansk, in Kharkiv region, the Russians have not only completed the capture of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, but they have now apparently crossed the Volcha River in force, and they have already captured significant areas of Volchansk south of the Volcha River, and the Ukrainian defenses in that area around Kharkiv city are collapsing. By the way, that may explain why Kharkiv city itself was apparently the target of a major Russian combined missile and drone attack last night. But anyway, instead of going through the details of the fighting, I wanted to turn to an article, an interview that's appeared today in The Guardian, fervently supportive of Ukraine, as we know. And it is an interview of Bogdan Krotevich, a former Azov brigade leader. Now, Krotevich was one of the members of the Azov brigade that fought in Mariupol, who hid for a time in the Azovstal steel factory, in the caverns underneath the factory, who surrendered to the Russians and was taken into captivity, who the Russians were then persuaded to swap for people of their own, and who then was transferred to Turkey, where Erdogan made a promise that they would stay for the duration of the war, a promise Erdogan promptly broke. Anyway, Krotevich returned to Ukraine, where he rejoined the Azov Brigade and went back fighting. Of course, this tangled story about Krotevich being sent to Turkey under a promise, which he also gave, by the way, that he would never rejoin the fighting, and that he broke it, and that Erdogan broke the arrangement. The Guardian doesn't mention any of that, nor does it mention the political orientation of the Azov Brigade, which once upon a time, 10 years ago, say, the Guardian extensively covered. Now that's a topic which Guardian readers are never informed of. But anyway, Mr. Krotevich has given a most interesting account of the situation in Ukraine. He says that Syrskyi must quit as the chief of staff. He himself, that's to say Krotevich, has now resigned from the military. He's no longer involved in the military. And he's saying that he is doing that so as to be able to campaign publicly against Syrskyi and the other military leaders who he says are losing the war. He complained that Syrskyi and the existing leadership are engaged in manual micromanagement of the whole army. He highlighted orders given to soldiers and units, forcing them to rest and base too close to the front. He said that this is illogical, that this makes them vulnerable to drone and artillery strikes by the Russians. He said that when he chose to return to the front, he became increasingly outspoken during his final period of military service, openly criticizing other commanders who he believed had been careless with soldiers' lives. He said that he had 70% decided to quit the Ukrainian military because commanders were still asking of soldiers things which they wouldn't ask of themselves. And he said that, he describes an absolutely grim picture. Soldiers have to rest within 50 meters of the front line, that this puts them in grave danger. He said that the leadership doesn't understand the effectiveness of FPV drones and glide bombs or how they work. He said that the FPV drones operate at ranges of up to 22 kilometers, and Russian glide bombs have also dramatically expanded the depth of the front line. The Guardian, by the way, says that until recently, Ukraine had struggled to stop Russian glide bombs. I'm not sure why the Guardian thinks the situation with glide bombs has changed at all. In fact, and to my knowledge, I discussed it in a recent program, Russian use of glide bombs continues to grow and is much higher now than it was at this time last year. Just saying. But anyway, he describes how the Azov Brigade's headquarters was itself struck. He said that there were terrible losses, and he also says that though the advance into Kursk region was originally a correct thing, he said that Syrskyi in particular became overly focused on the attack when we had huge issues defending Pokrovsk in southern Donbass and remained there too long. And he goes on to say that Ukraine has failed to find ways of prosecuting maneuver warfare, whilst the Russians somehow manage to break through our lines every month. And anyway, there's a lot more of that. And, well, one can see that even one of the former leaders of the Azov brigade, is effectively giving up. He no longer has any faith in the command, and he's describing an increasingly grim situation for the military in Ukraine. Now, I say all of this. There's actually recently been a flurry of articles in the media, especially here in Britain. There was one in the Daily Telegraph, one in The Economist of all places, about how Ukraine cannot be defeated, how the Ukrainians have this wonderful weapon which will keep the Russians indefinitely at bay, and how this weapon is drones, and how the Ukrainian drones have somehow managed to stop the Russians. There has been too much talk, in my opinion, about drones. I do not want to deny in any way that the Ukrainian drones, the drones generally, have an effect on the battlefronts. But they are not the wonder weapon in terms of military movement that many people imagine. The Russians not only have been able to absorb the problems caused by the drones and have found many methods to counter drones, and they will probably, over the course of this year, develop and refine more such methods. But even in drone warfare, they clearly have the advantage. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Ukrainian success in use of drones, for example, last year, and how this slowed the Russian offensive, which is not borne out in any way by the actual facts. As I said, the Russian offensive maintained a very rapid tempo until December. It then slowed in January and February and in February and March, but was still at a higher tempo than it had been in February and March of 2024, and has been increasing since. But anybody who followed the fighting last year closely, especially in the summer, would have been bound to notice that it was the Russians who were using the drones more effectively and more successfully than the Ukrainians were. I saw this repeatedly, that before the Russians attacked a particular location, they would send fleets of drones over the supply roads. That would then choke off the supplies to that location. Gradually, over the course of the summer, the Russians developed that into a kind of art form, almost. And it was again practiced with deadly effect in the fighting in Kursk region in March, triggering the disastrous collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in Kursk as well. So I am unable to understand why people fall for this narrative, and again, why they don't seem to relate or understand the actual events that are taking place on the front lines. Now, it's interesting that The Guardian has published this interview by Mr. Krotowicz, and it's appeared on the front page. It does make one wonder whether some people in The Guardian are beginning to have doubts, and whether there's some kind of preparation now, or some decision now, to try to prepare The Guardian's readership for a sudden big return of bad news as the Russian offensive in Ukraine accelerates. But given that the news from a Ukrainian and Western point of view is indeed going to become increasingly bad over the next few weeks and months, with increasing suggestions, by the way, that the Russians not only have Donbass and Zaporozhye city now in their sights, but might even be thinking again of Odessa. There's an interesting article, or rather video to that effect, between Glenn Deason and Andrei Martyanov, just saying. Anyway, move on. Even as there are, as I said, discussions, maybe preparations rather, for the fact that the military situation in Ukraine is deteriorating. What are the Western powers doing? Well, we are going to have another American-Russian meeting in Istanbul, and it's going to be on the Russian side, led by the new Russian ambassador to the United States, Mr. Darchev. It's going to be a different team from the United States, but these are middle-ranking people. It's clear that the Istanbul meeting is exclusively about sorting out the remaining serious problems with the embassies, the American embassy in Moscow and the Russian embassy in Washington. It does not address or even look at the wider problems of the US-Russia relationship or the situation in Ukraine itself. About an overall settlement of the conflict in Ukraine or diplomatic moves to try to end the fighting in Ukraine, we're hearing less and less. There appear to be no meetings arranged, and there's been a whole series of articles which have been appearing which are increasingly critical of the negative stance that the European Union, the Europeans have taken with respect to the attempt to conduct negotiations. So, for example, on a site called LNR, there's been, or Sidecar to be more precise, there's been an article called Preventing Peace by Fabian Schneider. It's very critical of the approach that the European powers have taken with respect to the military situation. It makes the point that the European leaders, I'll read from it. While some EU leaders have half-heartedly recognised Trump's demands for diplomacy, the bloc's dominant position since February 2022 that the fighting must not end without an absolute victory for Ukraine remains largely unchanged. Its foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, has long opposed efforts to de-escalate the conflict, declaring last December that she and her allies would do whatever it takes to crush the invading armies. And then he points out that others like Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, appear to agree with this stance. It speaks about how Anita Hipper, the spokesperson on foreign affairs of the European Commission, continues to insist on unconditional withdrawal of all Russian military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine. The article then goes on to say that this position appears to assume that Ukraine is capable of extirpating the Russians and recapturing all the land it has lost, a claim which is patently divorced from reality. And it points out that over the past year, Ukraine's position on the battlefield has been steadily deteriorating, its territorial losses are mounting, and its gains in the Russian regions of Kursk have been almost completely reserved. Each day brings the country closer to collapse as it loses more lives and piles up more debts. On the question of debts, by the way, there are increasing signs that the reduction in American financial aid is now starting to have an effect. The fiction that Ukraine still has a functioning economy is beginning to break down. The nominal growth rate, it's not a real growth rate, but it is falling. Inflationary pressures within Ukraine are rising. The Ukrainian government is running out of money to pay pensions and salaries. There's talk about higher taxes, though what there is left to tax, I have no idea. And once again, by the end of the year, the spectre of higher inflation continues to loom. But then, going back to Mr. Schneider, he then says, how does one explain this seemingly irrational behavior? And he refers to the very insightful American Indian writer Vijay Prashad, who suspects that European elites are primarily invested in preserving their legitimacy. They have invested too much capital in achieving a victorious peace to walk away now. And for that reason, for them, it is too early to even contemplate talks. There's other suggestions that they need the frenetic, the war to go on in order to justify their rearmament drive, that it's easier to somehow lift the boats of the sinking European economy through rearmament, and to cut welfare spending than to do anything else. And so why not keep the war going if it achieves at least that purpose? My own view, which I share with Alex Christoforou, is that European leaders are still not capable of absorbing the terrifying reality, terrifying for them, that the Russians are going to win the war. They still believe that provided a big enough commitment is made, somehow or other, the war can still be won. I don't think that has any possibility of success, but of course there are people who continue to hold on to it. So anyway, that is an article, as I said, by Fabian Scheidler, writing about how the Europeans are preventing peace. There's also another article by Ben Harris, which also looks at some of these same questions, published on his Substack blog, Radio Moskva, and he talks about how Donald Trump has been making promises to the Russians that he cannot keep. He promised the Russians sanctions relief in order to get the Black Sea deal underway. And he's also made demands of the Ukrainians that they can never satisfy with the mineral rights extraction deal. And that the effect of all of this is that it has left all discussions about a ceasefire at a standstill, that there's no realistic prospect now of achieving a ceasefire anytime soon, and that Trump himself is now showing signs of becoming uninterested in the Ukraine conflict, and that his own attention is now shifting to the more promising area, which is trying to do some kind of deal with Iran. And Ben Harris appears to feel that it's most unlikely that American military and economic aid for Ukraine is going to continue for very, very much longer. So that in the absence of a ceasefire, presumably the collapse of Ukraine without American help will probably begin sooner rather than later. Well, deep pessimism, therefore, about negotiations. And it is easy to share this. I tend to agree with this also. But I would say that what looks bleak today, and if one actually is someone who wants a negotiated outcome to the war, I know there are a lot of people who don't want to see that, but what might not look very realistic now might not look so unrealistic in a few months. I go with what Professor Mearsheimer said on a program that Glenn Deason and I did with him on the Duran. Professor Mearsheimer, over the course of that program, made the point that he thought that these moves by Donald Trump, to try to secure a ceasefire were premature. The Russians are not going to pull back from the demands that Putin made in June 2024, set out in June 2024, in his speech to the Foreign Ministry Board, the whole of the four regions, cast iron commitments that Ukraine will not join NATO, a complete reorganization of the internal arrangements of Ukraine to turn it into a peaceful and neutral country on good terms with Russia and no possible threat to it. And the Americans and the Western powers, and indeed the Ukrainians, are not yet at that point where they are prepared to accept those terms. Now, this whole calculus may change depending on the success of the Russian offensive. If, as I believe, the Russians break through, and going back to that article in The Guardian, that interview with the Azov brigade man, Bogdan Krotevich, if the Russians break through, and he seems to think they break through all the time in many places, if they break through and reach the Dnieper, if they take or are close to capturing the cities of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, if they take Pokrovsk, if they threaten or help it, or possibly even capture Zaporozhye, if it looks, in other words, as if the war continues, Ukraine will collapse either in the autumn of 2025 with hyperinflation starting to take hold, or perhaps if not in the autumn of 2025, in the spring of 2026, if we are brought to that point of final collapse, well, suddenly, amidst the panic and the fear and the wringing of hands, you might finally see diplomacy start to happen in earnest as people in Europe scramble to find ways to stop the Russian juggernaut from rolling on all the way to Lvov and to the Polish border. And it may be that concessions which today are being categorically ruled out across Europe suddenly gain acceptance, especially if, as is likely, by this time in the autumn, we will have a Europe in deep economic crisis. Now, having said that, of course, if we are there, if the Russians are breaking through, if they have reached the Dnieper, if they've captured the three cities, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka, if perhaps they've also captured Sumy and maybe even Zaporozhye itself, well, maybe by that point, the Russians might not be so keen to negotiate on the basis of what they offered in June 2024. Maybe by that point, they really will start to ask for more. Odessa, for example, or even more stringent conditions, concerning NATO. For example, the complete pullback of NATO forces from Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and Eastern Europe. Just saying. Well, how will the European powers, the Western powers, respond to all of that? And of course, it's also possible that the pendulum could swing in the other direction. Amid mounting hysteria, we could get more demands to send European troops to fight and hold back the Russians in Ukraine. Though if that were to happen, I would expect a complete revolt by the European public against this lunatic proposal. But anyway, I would not be surprised if big things start to happen in this conflict, diplomatically, at a political level, by the autumn and perhaps early winter of this year. Expecting big diplomatic movements now might be premature. Anyway, suffice to say that in Europe, things are already moving and starting to change. In Germany, even before he becomes Chancellor, Friedrich Merz's popularity is collapsing. He will probably be Chancellor, perhaps by tomorrow or even today. He's finally agreed his coalition deal with the SPD. But instead of having a honeymoon, his popularity has collapsed. His party, the CDU-CSU, is now polling at just 24% and has been overtaken by the AfD, which continues to rise and now polls 25%. The AfD is, as of today, according to the opinion polls, the most popular party in Germany. Now, well, more about that tomorrow. More about the latest negotiations with Iran and where they're going. More, of course, tomorrow also about the trade war, or rather the economic war, and also about the military situation in Ukraine. But this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.